So, a quick look at the historiography of Robin Hood, the sources and the difficulties around having a look at them and determining what they mean and whether or not we can find historical Robin. And also we can look at the historians' opinions about what these ballads mean and how they really view the search for trying to find the history from these ballads, whether it be through the social and political insights we can gain, or purely just looking for the historical figure himself, if he did exist. Now, regards the sources, so the earliest references around Robin Hood are found in chroniclers, who refer to the rhymes of Robin Hood, which was obviously presumably quite a popular occurrence in culture at the time, to make a note for the chroniclers to make notes about it. The most fleshed out early reference we get is from a Scottish chronicler called Walter Bower in 1440. He was the abbot of Inchcolm Abbey, which is near Fife, and the writer even gave us an example of the rhymes, which is very useful. Following this and a few more references among chroniclers, we have the earliest ballads that have come down to us. Now, it's an important note about the sources in general that Robin Hood is already considered established as a character in the ballads that have come down to us. These ballads clearly presume that the audience is already aware of the character and, to an extent, the stories that they tell. So the main one that we really looked at in the last video was the Jest of Robin Hood, and this is the major work that really covers Robin and his adventures. Historians have described it as the most ambitious retelling of the stories that's available from the early ballads. Now, it is late 15th century, so there are things that are still in existence that are presumed to be earlier than this. And the other thing is the ballad itself is not one story, it's an amalgamation of different stories. So, very useful. And we learn a lot, and most of what I've discussed kind of comes from this, and this was the main source that I studied when I did this in an academic setting, but probably not the earliest available work we have. So what might be the earliest work, one of the contenders, is the Robin and the Monk story. This is the oldest example of a single story, as the Jest is probably a compilation, as we've discussed. Although Robin and Guy of Gisborne may be older, they're both considered about mid-14th century as the earliest possible date they could be. They're all set in Barnesdale as well, so the locality, this is why I discussed that the locality of Barnesdale Forest is the most likely, because from everything we have surviving, the earliest records place Barnesdale. So despite the Sheriff of Nottingham's appearances, the locality is not really in question, especially amongst the earlier ones. Now, what kind of muddies the water around the Robin Hood tales is the existence of the Tail of Gamelin, which was potentially a 13th century source. So Maurice Keene, the historian, describes it as the earliest surviving outlaw text that we have left. It's present among Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, although he isn't the author, as far as we're aware. The existence of the text, due to the similarities between the story versus the Robin Hood tales, it somewhat supports the idea that Robin Hood, as a character, is potentially more a collective of different outlaw tales, which has led historians who focus more on the folklore tradition and reading those to doubt that an actual historical Robin Hood ever really existed. So to look at the historians in more detail, I will break down sort of where they lie on different aspects of historical investigation into the Robin Hood folklore. I also want to kind of talk about my own opinion and where I fall, having read a few of these guys. So one interesting aspect is who is the audience for the ballads. This has been heavily debated because it's obviously important as to the social insights and political insights. Who is this meant for? Now, J.C. Holt, who's a giant figure amongst medieval historians, he wrote a very important piece of work on the Magna Carta. He disagrees with the established groupings of Rodney Milton and Maurice Keene, who kind of back the idea that it was in support of peasant discontent and social protest. And he also disagrees with Dobson and Taylor, who were contending that this may be for an audience of growing yeomen in society. Holt instead argues that this is just escapist literature to be enjoyed in the feudal households, and therefore the ideas conformed with what would be acceptable among the feudal nobility. Based on more recent consensus, it's likely the audience was intended to be mixed, so that explains potentially why it was acceptable to the highest levels of society but still spoke to the lower levels, and that can be inferred from the harmony between the social classes in the ballads. There have been more, radical suggestions that the tales are linked to peasant unrest and potential rebellion, such as the Peasant Revolt of 1381. Both Keene and Holt refute this, and Keene himself is more sympathetic to the idea that it was aimed at the lower classes. J.C. Holt also looks at how Barnsdale is the most likely locality with some extra evidence, because he managed to trace the stories as they spread throughout England, noting that noble families from Wakefield moved to lands in Sussex and would have spread the stories there. Deep diving more into Maurice Keene and his opinions as well, he talks about the escapist nature of the tales too, the sense of the freedom in the outlaw life and the greenwood, and how this would have even, along with Holt, also talking about how the feudal nobles would have wanted to listen to this as well. Additionally, dives into the fighting the incompetent and corrupt authorities, and eventually sides with how this is a struggle for justice within the feudal system and not fighting the system itself. It was about guaranteeing justice that had already been promised by the system and wasn't being delivered. So it's Stephen Knight and Thomas Olgren, who have done a great job curating and commentating on the sources. They more hardcore position of not believing there is an actual individual Robin Hood. I'm going to read a little bit, but it's slightly paraphrased. The fact that this legend stretches back beyond just the sources we have, and the prolific of appearance of the name, do not, however, suggest there was one original Robin Hood, but that by the name generally refers to someone who was in some way outside or against the law as it was being imposed. That interpretation is strongly suggested by evidence from other areas, not considered by historians because it is neither individual nor criminal in orientation, but where in fact you find the largest number of earlier references to such a hero. So we have this historiographical divide between the real Robin Hood historians and those who see the stories as part of a grander oral and written tradition in folklore, rather than one based on an individual that could be found in history. Potentially, the tales are more an amalgamation of outlaw heroes and their story tropes, combined under one name. So my personal opinion, I'm something of a Robin Hood agnostic, having finished all the reading on this. There are clearly major flaws in the identifications that are put forward, especially with the Robert Hood of Wakefield example. However, there are some uncanny similarities as well, and Holt and other historians have made some very valiant efforts to tie the legend to legitimate records in history. So there may well have been a historical Robin who was responsible for some of the tales, and then later on he morphed into a more catch-all folklore character who had other outlaw tales attributed to him, and it grew into a bigger legend. But as Holt and Bellamy point out, we are just lacking in the sources, really, to be sure either way. So I don't see much point in either saying there definitely is a Robin, or that there definitely wasn't. So this one definitely was more of a ramble than it has been before. I don't want to scrap these videos. I think it's important that I do some sort of historiographical discussion after I post a main video. And I don't want to script these either, because it's kind of more fun for me to have a video where I don't have a script to read from, and I can talk about my process, my own opinions of the history, and the difficulties and interests and peculiarities that I came upon among the historians and the sources when I was doing the research. Hopefully I'm just going to get better at these, and these rambles get a bit easier to listen to. But for now, obviously, I'm just starting out, so I'm a bit less experienced. Same with the scripted stuff. I want to get more immersive as well. maybe less making it sound like I'm reading out a history essay. But we'll get there. We'll get there eventually. At the moment, I'm just learning how to research and edit and sort out all these videos. But this one was a particular fun for me to research because it actually involved a lot of the local areas that I'm familiar with. And I got to delve into way more detail than I did back at university, so that was fun. But yeah, thank you for listening to me mumble through this one. And yeah, farewell.